found themselves in. On the one hand, they were colonial subjects, and they resented being colonial subjects. It's very clear that none of these pioneers were supporters of colonialism, because they did not want to live under colonial rule, especially because they saw colonial rule as being secular colonial rule. But on the other hand, they saw the benefits of modern colonial governance. Abdullah, for instance, in his Kisah Pelayaran again, has a long comparative note comparing the British colonial army to the Malay armies in the Malay kingdoms. You know, and he says there's an episode before the British invade Java during the Napoleonic Wars. There's an episode where the entire colonial army of British India are parked in Malacca, and he tours their camps and he says, look, how is it that the British have managed to bring together Punjabis, Pathans, Tamils, Gurkhas, Nepalese? They are all together in one army, wearing the same uniform, following the same drill. And how is it that they could actually instill discipline in a cosmopolitan group of an assembly of forces, whereas in the Malay states, you have the army of Pahang made up of people from Pahang, and yet they have no discipline whatsoever. So this is the thing that they try to diagnose. So in all their writings, the critical edge of their writings is always to expose what they see as a lack of punctuality, a lack of efficiency, a lack of honesty, transparency, a lack of accountability, and this is then diagnosed in terms of a discourse that is couched in Islamic ethics. And this is from this very, mixed hybrid cosmopolitan community then emerges the Kaum Muda wave, the first wave of the Kaum Muda activists by the 1920s. Now, let's look at the other half of that. As I said earlier, the first stage of colonial rule began with the creation of the Strait settlements. Now, by the 1860s and 1870s, cognizant of the fact that there were enormous resources, particularly tin at the time, the capitalist lobby behind the business enterprises that were active in the Straits settlements were lobbying for direct intervention into Malay affairs. So you needed a pretext for this. You needed a pretext to go into the Malay kingdoms and indirectly colonize them. And this forward movement policy found its rhetoric in precisely, ironically, the sort of discourse that people like Sheikh Al-Hadi and Munshi Abdullah were constructing. There was a conjunction of interests between the Malay Muslim modernists who saw Islam in crisis and the Malay world in crisis, and the British colonial administrators who likewise saw the Malay states in crisis but used that as a justification for colonial intervention. And so by the 1850s and 60s, we begin to see tentative steps inwards, which eventually led to the creation of the first pseudo-colony of the Federated Malay States, which brings together Selangor, Perak, Negeri Sembilan, and Pahang. And this was eventually referred to as the FMS, the Federated Malay States. One of the landmark moments that actually contributed to the creation of the Federated Malay States was the 1874 Treaty of Pangkor between the British colonial administrators and the Sultan of Perak, whereby in order to, while intervening in a civil war, between three different factions, supported King Abdullah, got him to sign the Pangkor Treaty, and from this point onwards, the Pangkor Treaty laid out a clear division of power between the colonial administrators and the Malay kings, where the colonial administrators would take care of basically modern state governance, economy, development, education, relieving the Malay rulers of Selangor, Pahang, Perak, and Negeri Sembilan with the relatively smaller area of concern, which is basically religion and adat. So the 1874 Pangkor Treaty basically introduces for the first time a strict division between state and religion. Religion becomes a Malay-Muslim affair in the hands of the Malay kings, whereas governance, administration, the economy is entirely under the control of the colonial administrators. Much later on, by the early 20th century, the last four states, Kedah, Kelantan, Terengganu, end up being incorporated as the unfederated Malay states, and of course Johor is the last state to actually come under colonial rule, something in just before World War II in fact. So you see that British colonization actually took place step by step in stages, and it was not just the creation of a centralized colonial apparatus, but actually what you have were three different modes of colonial rule. Direct, immediate colonial rule in the Strait settlements, indirect colonial rule in the federated Malay states, and even less direct colonial rule in the unfederated Malay states. So the colonial power, if you like, was centered in places like Ipoh in Perak, Kuala Lumpur in Selangor, Malacca, Penang, and Singapore. Whereas in the outer states, further you go from the political capital,